All right, now let's talk about Pandas built-in visualization. So this is our notebook number 5. Again, this is going to be a quick one like the previous one. So for Pandas visualization, let me do the full screen. Let's import the NumPy libraries as NP and Pandas, of course, as PD, right? Then let's run this cell. Let's import the data, the GDP CSV, right? Do you remember we generated this GDP CSV somewhere, I think in one of those notebooks? So let's take a look at this data set. Okay, we have date and we have GDP, and it goes to, let's say, yeah, the last one is the 1st of April 2019. So this is quarterly data, right? Let's say we want to do some visualization using Pandas library. Remember, Panda was useful whenever we are working with data frame and things like that, right? So for that reason, Panda itself comes with a built-in visualization features. So whenever you're working with data frame, it's a good idea to use Pandas visualization itself instead of Matplotlib. And later on, we're going to see that, you know what, Seaborn is even better, more powerful than Panda. So let's work with Seaborn. So throughout the semester, most of the time I will use Seaborn, but sometimes I use Matplotlib and sometimes Pandas. But again, most of the time Seaborn. Again, this is just basically the matter of taste. You know, you can use any of them. You can use any of the libraries, or you can, for example, Google thing and see what is offered, and then you can copy and paste it from there. Really doesn't matter which visualization you want to work with specifically, as long as you get the output that you want. That's it. And again, this is in my opinion. Some people only want to work with Seaborn, some people only with Pandas, but in my opinion, it really doesn't matter. Okay, so let's read the CSV file GDP, save it as DF, and look at the head of that data frame. So this is my data frame, okay? And I'm going to define a new variable, call it growth. And that growth is defined as this. So take the GDP column for me. There is the very useful method out of a data frame we can use. It's called PCT change. This is percentage change. When I say percentage change, open close parenthesis 1, let me actually pull up the contextual help again. It basically says that, okay, for example, here it's going to, you want to calculate the GDP growth, okay? So basically it says that GDP in the second period minus GDP in the first period divided by the GDP in the first period, right? This is a growth if the period is 1. If I want to calculate the growth when the period is 3 or 2, so it's going to say, okay, take this one, subtract this one, the first one, and then divide it by the first one, right? So usually the growth makes sense if you take the difference from next period, right? So we say percentage change 1. And now let's look at the head. Not surprisingly, the first observation is NA. It's not available number. Why? Because, you know, I have the GDP in the 1st of January 47, but I cannot calculate the growth because I need the GDP for from the previous quarter. So because I don't have this one, it's not able to calculate that. However, what about this one? So if I want to calculate this number manually, so what are we doing? We're saying this number. Of course, there's going to be some rounding errors as well, right? We say, okay, that number 245.968 divided by 243.164, the entire thing minus 1, right? So basically this. So it's going to 0.0115, 0.0115, right? So there, again, of course, there's some rounding error as well. So this is what's going on when you use the percentage change. This is a very useful method. Okay, now I have the head of the data set. I look at the head of the data frame, and I have date, GDP, growth. Now let's play around with some of the functions from the pandas, right? So for example, I can look at the info. The first one, date, is an object. And usually we want to change the object because, so for example, we want to change them to a timestamp, not necessarily object or integer or float or you name it, any kind of different class, but not object. But in this exercise, we're not going to be super worried about the type of these dates. Later on, when I teach you about the time series, we're going to convert these dates to into indices. But for now, that's well, we can do it now. But that in the time series, I'm going to cover it in more details, right? So for example, I'm going to say that make a new column, call it date, and we're going to use this, let's say, method from the pandas library. It's called toDateTime. ToDateTime what? So look at the data set. I have a column date. Basically, I say that, okay, change that column date to a date time and put it in this in a variable called date. I'm literally replacing this column with a date type version of that. It's not going to be object anymore, right? So the first line is going to do that. Let me actually do them separately. So let me separate these lines. So if I run this line, now if I look at the info of the data frame, you see the object changed. The date used to be object, now it's date 64. So date 64 is a type of date time series. 64 is reserved for the pandas type of date time. Okay, and then I can set the index. So I say, okay, take that data frame and set the index. And what do you want to? What is that? What is your key? It's going to be date in place is equal to true. It basically says that replace this column for me in the data set, right? Replace this one and put this one, the date, as an index, right? So this is what's doing. Look at the head of the data set, okay? So now I have a date. These are the indices. I have GDP, I have GDP growth. Okay, now let's do some visualization. Now that we are using pandas, we know that DF it's a data frame and it belongs to pandas, right? I can say, okay, show me, for example, the GDP. Let me see this spelling is correct. Yeah, GDP. Now I can say dots and see what are the options. Press tab and wait for if it suggests something for me. Yeah. Because I think because there are lots of things, you have to specifically tell what you're looking for. So I can do histogram, I can do, for example, scatter, I can do box plot, I can do, different kind of plots, right? If I do histogram and then plot it, why is it complaining about the histogram? Yeah, most probably. Let me see if I can run this line. Yeah, GDP, I'm not quite sure why I do not see the histogram of the, it doesn't need bins by default, I can say, let's say. Yeah, it was waiting for bins. So if I look at the histogram, bins, there is no, the default for bin is 10. I don't know why it didn't work previously, but let me try this one. Yeah, it should have worked, even though if I don't write anything here, it should work. Yeah, I don't know why the first time it didn't. Because the default number is 10, so I don't need to pass it on. Anyways, so this is a histogram for the GDP. I can look at the histogram for the growth. So as you can see, GDP itself is not normally distributed. It's not surprising. It's going to be right tail. And but the histogram, of course, because it's growth, the histogram for the growth, because we're talking about growth, it's most probably normally or close to normal distribution. Nothing surprisingly here. Then you can play around with the different features of your histogram, for example. So in general, there are two ways that in pandas you can do plots. So I can directly say df a column and then histogram, or I can say df a column plot and change the kind to histogram. Okay, so this is both ways are going to work the same, right? So if I say, okay, kind is histogram, now let's look at the histogram with beans. So these are the same. Yeah, and here's a list, just a very short list of what you can do with this plot function in pandas. So for example, you can look at the area plot, pie plot, histogram, line, scatter, bar plot, box plot, density function. So this is a density itself. This is KDE. We're going to look at actually one of these things during this semester. Okay, now, and by default, if I don't pass anything as a kind to plot function, it's going to think of it as a line, right? So if I do plot, by default, the kind is going to be line. Can you see that? Okay. So the kind is going to be line. So it means that if I do growth and then plot, it's going to give me the line. Actually, if I, let me actually give it a try. If I pass the entire data set and then do plot, the scaling is not going to be good, but automatically Python understands that this data frame of yours has two columns. One of them is GDP, the other one is growth. So it's going to automatically realize that, and the index, of course, is date. It says that, okay, growth is something like this, and then GDP is something like that. So we know that this is not necessarily the best visualization because growth, of course, is around 0, but GDP itself will increase. So a better idea is that if I, for example, use growth on the right axis and then GDP on the left axis and then plot it. So I leave it as an exercise. Just Google it and see if you can do that, right? All right, and then, for example, we can look at the scatter plot. Let's say X is growth, Y is GDP. So this is my scatter plot. Again, guys, if you don't want to see these lines above your plot, you can do PLT show. Well, if you want to do PLT show, actually, this is a good thing that's happening. Because I haven't defined PLT up there, it doesn't understand. So if you want to use the features from the matplotlib, you have to import the matplotlib, let's say at the top of this notebook. So we can do import matplotlib.pyplot as PLT. Now it will understand what is PLT. If I go back here and then do PLT.figure and .show, it's not going to complain, right? I'm glad that these errors are happening, and we can see how we can fix them online. Okay, then we can do the box plot for the growth. We can do the KDE. Again, this is kernel density estimation plot. This is the estimation of our, it shouldn't take that much long. So something is going on. It's an estimation of the distribution for the growth, right? Again, this shouldn't take that much long, but anyways. So we can do PLT, show. And as you can see, I'm using a combination of pandas visualization and matplotlib. And later on, you will see that sometimes we use a combination of all the three, right? So whatever works for you best. So for example, if I want to change the figure size, I do PLT fixed size, and was it fixed size? Well, yeah, we're going to give it a try. I'm not sure what was that. Size is equal to, I don't think this is going to work, but let's see, 10 and 5. Well, no, it wasn't. PLT. Anyways, we had this fixed size before, but again, this is a good example that you don't need to necessarily memorize these things. We're going to change the fixed size a ton later on. Okay, so that was pretty much it. And let's keep this video also short. I will see you in the next one that we're going to talk about seaborne visualization. This one is going to be a little longer because seaborne is something that we're going to use for the course. All right, see you in the next one.